President Lee Jae Myung has been featured in Time magazine's 100 Photos of 2025, and on Press Perspective today we touch upon this featuring and more career-related news and international headlines in recent days. Hello and welcome. You're watching Press Perspective for this Thursday, December 18th here in Seoul. I'm Min Sunhee. Today we shed light on a number of stories here that made international headlines, starting with those related to the current president as well as his predecessor and the English section of South Korea's annual college entrance test, better known as Suneung. For this, I have Fabian Kretschmer with German news agency DPA here in the studio. Fabian, welcome back.
Great to be here.
I also have Thomas Maresca with American news agency UPI here with us. Thomas, it's lovely to have you here.
Thank you. Great to be here.
Fabian, we shall start with you. So let's begin with President Lee Jae Myung's featuring in the 100 Photos of 2025 as selected by Time magazine and its significance, Fabian.
Well, Time magazine is, at least has been, the benchmark for photojournalism, like a gold standard, especially back in the days when print journalism was still more relevant. So Time magazine was known for having excellent photojournalism. So if you're chosen within the 100 pictures, 100 photos of 2025, of course, it's an honor. There are photos chosen from all walks of life, from sport events, natural disasters, earthquakes, political photos. For example, one photo that was also chosen was from Beijing with Putin, Kim, and Xi during the military parade I think that happened in October or so. So all the most important historic pictures, and Lee Jae Myung was among them. The picture was taken on the 4th of June. That was just before the election outcome was published. I would say the photo is interesting on two levels. I think from an aesthetic point of view, it's quite interesting because you see Lee Jae Myung's face three times, his real face, his face in a reflection in a glass window, and then a very oversized face back in the back on a screen. And he looks quite, or he has a poker face, so you cannot really read that he's about to become president. It's quite a historic moment for South Korea, a plot point, so to speak. But he seems kind of cool and serious. It's the calm of before the storm, so to speak.
Right. President Lee Jae Myung was also included in Time magazine's 100 most influential people of this year, right, Thomas? And this inclusion took place before his presidential election victory.
Yes, correct. It was in mid-April that he was included, and this is another thing Time is obviously well known for, is its 100 most influential list. So yeah, it came at very much this kind of pivot point. It was an interesting timing. It was mid-April, so it was after Yoon's impeachment had been upheld and he was removed from office, but before the election. So, we really were at this kind of, focal point in what had happened and what was yet to come. And, certainly Lee Jae Myung was kind of considered the strong front runner to become the next president, and that's sort of how they framed it. But, the little text that went along with the selection, talked about the role he played in the coup and its aftermath, the night of, how he was live streaming, climbing over the wall to get into the National Assembly, and how he was obviously one of the leaders of the push to, for the impeachment of Yoon afterwards. And it even sort of framed his life story as a bit as, someone who has survived a lot of things. It talked about, the fact that he lost the election in 2022 to Yoon and was now probably poised to win it. His childhood, just his injury as a youth laborer in a factory, and his own being stabbed in 2024, which I'd almost forgotten about, so sort of framing him as someone who might be ready to meet the moment, who has been through a lot of challenges. And so, it wasn't so much a selection that I think was based on what he had done to that point. It felt almost more like, this was the person of the moment at an extremely important moment in South Korean history, and it almost felt like you had to choose something. It was such an important, global story throughout the at least the part of the year. So he seemed, to be sort of the most viable or likely candidate to sort of represent all that had happened in South Korea and represent, the future.
Right, and staying with that, his predecessor, former President Yoon Suk-yeol, also made quite a bit of headlines this week, Fabian, following findings by the Special Counsel team after its 6-month probe into the former administration's short-lived martial law declaration. So what did the Special Counsel team find, and what are your takeaways?
Well, yeah, those headlines he made, they were quite negative. They were shocking, to say the least. So the two main findings were that the plans for martial law, for implementing martial law, date back to at least October 2023, so more than 1 year before Yoon Suk-yeol actually implemented it. And the second fact is that he obviously tried to get North Korea into a military conflict to then justify his martial law plans. Let me break that down. When Yoon Suk-yeol implemented martial law, actually, and the state here experienced a profound crisis, most observers, experts, journalists, they struggle to really find out why did he do that. And, many people, actually many diplomats, assumed that this was the spontaneous reaction of a politician who was really trapped into a corner, and he kind of snapped out of it and was kind of a little bit desperate and very irrational. But no, now it seems that it was the opposite. It was a calculated plan that dates back to over 1 year before actually the plan was implemented. We probably know that, or at least the special investigators, they reviewed documents, text messages, all of that, and they indicate that it was a really well-calculated plan. And the second thing that I would say is even more shocking, Yoon Suk-yeol apparently risked getting into a military conflict, basically risked a war with a nuclear power, with North Korea. Why do the investigators think so? Well, there was a secret drone operation. So, and indeed, North Korean state media presented a drone that was that crashed next to Pyongyang, and yeah, at that time, North Korea thankfully did not react military, so they didn't take the bait, so to speak. So the military escalation did not happen, but I mean, I really don't want to imagine what could have happened if North Korea actually would have escalated. Yeah.
Right, neither do we. Thomas, a survey meanwhile finds that the political divide here in South Korea is deepened after the short-lived martial law declaration of last December. Could you walk us through the findings with regard to the reasons behind this reality, that is a deeper political divide, and what are your own observations here on the ground?
Yes, so there was a survey that was commissioned by the Jungang Ilbo newspaper that was held by Gallup Korea that found that 77% of respondents said that political polarization has worsened since, this was done like 1 year after the initial coup or martial law attempt. And yeah, that said it's gotten worse since then, and only 18% disagreed. And actually at first you were showing the footage of that night, and I was a little bit surprised just to think, wow, it's gotten worse since then, because in a sense that felt like, that was the height of political division. But I sort of realized, thinking about it afterwards, of course, that did come as, I mean, obviously these divisions have existed for a long time, and I mean predating Yoon and Lee Jae Myung as well. But in the aftermath, I think there was the initial shock, but then the sort of almost like the hardening of some of the positions really started to take place afterwards. And I think, particularly on the side of Yoon's supporters, I mean, initially I think there was shock, and a lot of people disavowed, the overwhelming majority disavowed what he had done. But then there's sort of the narrative started to take hold of, why he had done it. He himself never really walked back, why he did it, and always sort of stuck to the reasoning that he gave for it, which was saying that, the opposition party was obstructing everything he was trying to do. And that just kind of hardened, and then there was those periods of weeks and months that, first there was the vote for impeachment, then the sort of attempt to arrest him that dragged out, and then the court, deliberation process dragged out, and there was, this growing movement of his supporters. And, we could see almost in real time some of the narratives taking shape that, went beyond sort of the traditional divisions of the parties and moved into this idea of, there's exterior forces at work. There became this kind of stop the steal thing that aligned with some of the, the conspiracy theories in the U.S. So we saw that happening, and I think that really represents still, I think, to some extent where we are. We realize that, where are people getting their information? Where are people getting their opinions, in a sense? And that hasn't really changed. There's still this kind of algorithmically driven, two realities: YouTube, social media, TikTok. And so I think that is still kind of keeping, even now, the narratives, both sides. I mean, on the side of the supporters of Lee Jae Myung and the ones who protested against the martial law attempt and called for the impeachment, I mean, clearly they felt, and I think probably most of the Western world and the media sees it this way as well, that this was a defense of democracy, and certainly that's how the Lee Jae Myung administration is not letting it sort of go. I mean, they really are focusing a lot on this as a major important event that they're not trying to forget. But then you have the opposition has still kind of hardened into this sense of, we're actually the ones defending democracy against this China controlled, or this in some cases it's Lee Jae Myung being kind of tyrannical or power hungry, and so that there's that narrative. And then you have the supporters on both sides and the people themselves, and then the political parties. The PPP, Yoon's party, hasn't fully distanced itself from him either. There's some division within that, though. We saw some members apologize on the anniversary, but the party itself didn't officially apologize. So at the end of the day, it still is also such a two-party system that, in a sense, there's nowhere for some of these people to go. It's like Lee Jae Myung's approval rating has been above 50% and has relatively been high, but the PPP's approval rating is still something like 35% or so. So that's a lot of people that still support the party, and it, by sort of extension, are supporting Yoon. So I think just added together, you can see where these lasting divisions are. And yeah, on the ground, I mean, Fabian as well, I think, has been to some of these events. There are sometimes protests will spring up. There was a lot of anti-China protests recently, especially before APEC. And it really still spills over into these, bring Yoon back movement, or, China manipulating the election. They're sometimes taking actual issues and kind of spinning it out into these larger divisions. So I think, yeah, still at this point, I can understand, I guess, why people said that divisions remain.
That political polarization is still evident here on the local front then. Fabian, let's move now from the political arena to the academic arena. The BBC recently highlighted the, and I'm quoting, insane English section of South Korea's college entrance test, the Suneung. Do tell us more about this coverage.
Yeah, actually the BBC story is really a fun read, but it's a serious matter, at least for South Koreans. Suneung, the college entrance exam, is incredibly important. It's a day of basically a one-day test that determines your whole life, determines to which university you can go, which networks you can build, which job you will get, etc. So it's of course very sensitive for young Koreans. And as part of the Suneung, there's always an English speaking test, or actually not only speaking, it's a written test. And if you look at the questions, the criticism that this test was really too difficult, wow, it's totally justified. I also read the questions, and I mean, I wouldn't have been able to answer them. One was about Immanuel Kant, like a German philosopher, and another, basically they were unnecessarily complicated, and it's not really about how well your English is or not. I mean, you can see me struggling sometimes. I'm not a native speaker, but I bet really $100 that also Thomas wouldn't have been able to answer every of those questions, because they were made unnecessarily complicated. So in the end, only a few percentage percentage of students would answer them correctly. And indeed, only 3% scored the highest score. Last year, it was 6%. Yeah, actually, this English test, you get 70 minutes and have to answer 45 questions. Well, I find this story quite important, this topic, also this public debate about this English test. Koreans have a big obsession about test results and a big obsession about hagwons, about after-school tuition. They spend a lot of money for the education of their children, which, I mean, of course, is a good thing, but I think it's excessively here. And there is a discrepancy between the results, the outcomes, because most Koreans, I would argue, are studying to get a good test result, but it's not necessarily whether you can actually then be able to speak English or not. That is not so important. It's only you have to pass the test. And why do I say this? Because I travel to a lot of countries, and sometimes there are populations, they don't care so much about investing so much money into English education, but they speak comparatively better English on average than Koreans. Why? Because they want to speak it, or they have to because of touristic reasons, whatever. I think if you really have the willing to speak English, then it will work. But if it's only the pressure from outside to pass a test, then I think the outcome, the English speaking ability, will suffer. That is my opinion.
Right then. Thomas, what's your opinion? I mean, what is your assessment of the English part of the Suneung test this year?
Yes, they are, it is extremely difficult. There was, the New York Times did a little story about it as well and had 4 sample questions, and you could do the multiple choice yourself. And I did get 3 out of 4, I have to say. I was sort of proud of that, but it was really hard. I mean, a couple I was not sure at all. And I mean, the test, the questions were, as you mentioned, there was one about Kant and Hobbes, about the rule of law and human freedom. Another discussed culturetainment, which is a word that you can kind of get the meaning, but it's not something that is in really active use. I don't think I'd ever heard it. Another was describing time as a repetitive process embedded in a machine, and then it was about watches and, I don't know, other timers. And then there was another that was about avatars and video games, and a quote, this was the start of it. A video game has its own model of reality, internal to itself and separate from the player's external reality, the player's bodily space, and the avatar's bodily space.
You've lost me
And
there.
then you were supposed to sort of follow along and find a place to insert. So really, really difficult. I mean, I would say that obviously it seemed that this year was excessively so, but this is actually something I've heard for quite a while. I've seen these sample English tests or English questions in years past. It's almost like an online joke or meme that like how ridiculously hard the English is. And I just think it's something that is, not as Fabian was talking about. It's not really something you can see as practical or useful as far as usable English. I mean, they seem intentionally tricky, dense, obscure kind of. I think that is, critics of this have talked about how this is just a flaw in the kind of Suneung. To some extent, I think in general, I've heard also that the Korean language can be this part of the exam, can also be similarly sort of dense and tricky. And the idea is that, it's not necessarily testing practical knowledge, but, it kind of encourages or forces you to study for the test. And so I think that applies in some sense to the Suneung in general, but I think the English side of it is really, highlighted where, what are you really learning, and I mean, I guess some that would defend it are saying it's, perhaps preparing students to work through the types of difficult texts they might encounter in the university level. But I think when you only have 3% or whatever it is passing at the highest level, there's something that's not aligned. And one other side of that was they had actually changed the English evaluation to be kind of an absolute grading. Some of the other parts of the Suneung are relative, it's how did you do versus the other test takers. And they changed English, I think in 2018, to just be an absolute mark. And the idea was so that people wouldn't rely as much on going to hagwons, and doing all this extra study. It would just be less directly competitive. But I think in the aftermath of this, there's some articles where parents are like, oh, now I need to send my kid to another English hagwon as well as all of the other things. So it's kind of had the opposite effect of that it was intended to. And I think that just highlights, what are some of the bigger concerns about Suneung in general. On the one hand, it is supposed to be this sort of meritocratic, everyone takes the same test, but we see how, there's inequality and advantages that people that have more access to tutoring and training, have a big advantage. And this English part was supposed to sort of address that, but I think it ended up highlighting it even further. So, it becomes an ongoing debate, as Fabian also mentioned.
Right, and making international headlines as well.
Yep.
Fabian, moving forward, it's International Migrants Day here in today, that is, and recent findings show that 1 out of every 20 households here in South Korea has a migration background. First, do tell us a bit about these particular findings, and second, Fabian, what are your takeaways?
Yeah, it's quite interesting. So 1 out of 20 means 5% of the population has a migration background. And in total, it's 2.7 million people. 1/4 of them actually have a Korean passport, but roughly 3/4 don't. That is quite remarkable because Korea always prided itself as a very ethnic, homogeneous society, but now it's becoming very multicultural. And maybe compared to European countries or the US, it's still in the beginning stage of that, but it's definitely noticeable in the speed, or the speed of change is quite remarkable. Whenever I travel, especially outside of Seoul, you see a lot of the young people are actually foreigners. Because there's a big demographic change in Korea, and many young people go to Seoul. So actually in many satellite cities outside of Seoul, or cities a little bit far away from Seoul, they are actually very multicultural already. If you look at the numbers, of course, the majority of foreigners are Chinese, also the Korean, ethnic Korean Chinese, Vietnamese, people from Thailand, US people, and also from Uzbekistan. Europeans like me, we are still a rare breed in Korea. I think we're not even in the top 20, but I think France and Germany, they have roughly 11,000 people here in South Korea. So that will probably also grow with the success of the soft power here and the attraction that South Korea holds also to Europe. So it's quite interesting. South Korea is getting more multicultural. That is a reality.
Right, indeed. Thomas, all this being said, what do you suppose are the pros and cons of life for a family with a migration background here in South Korea?
Yeah, well, I think the pros are just sort of the advantages of South Korea overall, that why a lot of us like to live here. There's just safety, infrastructure, public transportation, good health care, that sort of thing. And, we were talking about education, but I think for the difficulties of education, but I think for a lot of families, it's a great opportunity for their children. And we're also seeing more students, foreign students coming here. That's become a big sort of pull. And I think as the demographic changes and the challenges are happening, there's more sort of, you see the government trying to open up job opportunities in sectors like, in tech and, semiconductors to attract foreign talent. So there is a bit of more welcoming and opportunity on that front. The cons are probably, as Fabian mentioned, the homogeneous nature of the society, I think, does make it difficult for most foreigners to feel ever fully integrated. I mean, you can feel comfortable here, but never necessarily. It's very difficult, I think, to feel part of the society. And I think, for some of the workers and young people coming here, it is also difficult. It still is hard on the visa front to stay here longer. But, I think it becomes a bit of a self-sustaining or self-growing system. If there are more multicultural families, there will create more communities that people will, feel more sort of at home and welcome in. So we'll see if it grows and continues to develop in that front.
Right, we shall see if it does indeed. I'm afraid that's all the time we have. Thomas, as always, thank you so much for your time and your thoughts.
Thank you.
Fabian, thank you very much for your insights. Right, like I said, that is all the time we have for this edition of Press Perspective. As always, thank you for watching. See you same time tomorrow.